Old Grognard says, let's look at how treasure works in 2nd edition AD&D. If you're new here, welcome to the channel. If you're a returning viewer, welcome back. I'm your host, Old Grognard, and not too long ago I got a request for a video on how the treasure tables work. I figure if one person asked, there are probably others with the same question that just haven't asked yet. This video is about 2nd edition treasure in general, so it's not only going to cover how the tables work, but also the game developers' ideas on how to use treasure as a DM tool and their philosophy on treasure in general. I'm also going to comment on things, tell you some of my interpretations, and go off on some tangents. You might want to grab a beverage because this video is a bit longer than what usually goes on this channel. Let's get started. The first question the DMG tackles is, what is treasure? The answer to this question may seem obvious at first, but I think it's good that the book starts out by giving us a broad idea of what qualifies as treasure. Treasure doesn't always take the obvious forms we've come to expect, such as coins, gems, art objects, and magic items. Some less obvious forms of treasure the DMG gives examples of are bolts of fine linen, valuable furs, casks of wine, and tons of iron ore. It also mentions documents like those granting land, privileges, titles, rights of taxation, or exemption from taxes. The point made with all of this is that treasure can take many different forms, and not all of them are obvious things we can roll for on the treasure tables. The next concept the DMG goes into is that the DM decides how much treasure there is and where it's found. This isn't presented as being an absolute godlike power for the DM to lord over the players, but rather as a major responsibility the DM has, and one they should put some serious thought into so they don't screw it up. I don't think anything would be gained from trying to summarize this part, so I'll just read it. The DM places, awards, and controls the treasures that appear in their campaign. The amount of treasure, both monetary and magical, the characters receive will have great effects on the development of the campaign. For this reason, several questions should be answered before play begins. Is the world poor in magical items such that the discovery of a simple healing potion will be seen as a great reward? Or is it rich in magical items such that the player characters will have many and will use them often just to survive? Will their supply of magical items be so great as to render them all but unstoppable? Will the player characters be forced to undertake dangerous adventures just to have food from day to day? Or will they have so much wealth that their adventures will involve those of the highest levels of society and power? Will the characters have too much money, making them difficult to coerce, bribe, threaten, or even challenge? Will they be poor, and possibly depressed and frustrated? Only the DM can answer these questions, and answer them he should, for they will shape the campaign as surely as any other single factor. With this, we can see that not only are treasure amount and placement explained as DM responsibilities, they're also portrayed as world-building tools, whether you want them to be or not. As part of them being world-building tools, we get to ask and answer the question, where did all this treasure come from? And the DMG talks about this in the section titled Placement of Treasure on page 80. The first point made is that it's unusual that there is all this treasure that's just out there for the taking. For this to make sense, we have to look at three related ideas that lead to there being a world of forgotten treasure, and they go like this. Premise 1. Long ago the world was a wealthier place since all this money has been taken out of circulation. Premise 2. Once the world was more culturally advanced, since only an organized society can control things like minting on a large scale. And Premise 3. The world has fallen into a dark age, since now these same hoards are eagerly sought after by adventurers and there are few governments able to mint such amounts of coinage. The three premises not only apply to coinage, but to other types of treasures as well. The previous civilization might have made materials that can't be duplicated in the current time, like certain metallic substances, textiles, magic items, or even technological items. The point is that they used to make stuff that we can't make anymore, or they made it on a scale we can't duplicate. As a side note, a lot of game settings use this concept, and they're not all fantasy settings. Gamma World has pre-cataclysm tech items fill the role of magic items. In Battletech 3025, most of the tech can't be built anymore and can only be maintained or repaired. But anyway, there's ancient treasure out there. That stuff is valuable, so there are going to be adventurers and treasure hunters going out to find these hoards of treasure. But what does an actual treasure hoard look like? The modern idea of dead enemies dropping loot out of hammer space like we see in video games was alien to the developers back in the late 80s. When they wrote this part, they instead took the time to think about what the treasure in a lair or on a creature would look like if the game was happening for real. In order to facilitate this imagining of treasure, they broke treasure hoards down into two categories: those of intelligent creatures and those of unintelligent creatures. Let's start with unintelligent creatures. The unintelligent creature hoards are broken down further into two groups: unintentional and intentional. Examples of unintentional creatures given in the DMG are the refuse pile outside of a cave bear's cave, or the trash strewn about the base of a massive tree that happens to contain a giant eagle nest. Also in this category would be the stomach contents of monsters, though this one is uncommon. Intentional treasures would be things that the creature or creatures collect on purpose, like how in our world magpies, crows, and raccoons are known to collect shiny objects. Another example might be if a giant bird weaves a magic rope into its nest, or a creature has taken a cloak to use as bedding. Regardless of whether a creature is intentionally or unintentionally gathering treasure, the hoard will tend to reflect the behavior of one or more animals rather than the behavior of a person or group of people. The intelligent creature hoards are also broken into two groups. This time they're divided by motives, using dragons and hobgoblins as examples. With the dragon, we have a creature who hoards treasure for no discernible reason, or at least a reason we can't relate to. Dragons don't generally buy stuff with their treasure or use it to really do anything. They hoard it because they're dragons and that's what they do. On the hobgoblin end of things, we have more relatable motives. We can easily think of several reasons hobgoblins would have a treasure of some kind. The leader may have to pay underlings, buy weapons and armor, or even pay tribute to the local warlord. If they have magic items they can use, they'll probably use them. The overarching point of all of this is that intelligence, intentionality, and motives should all be taken into consideration when planning and presenting a treasure hoard in your game. The last concept from the DMG that I'm going to cover before we get into the treasure tables is random treasure versus planned treasure, and once again, I'm just going to read rather than trying to paraphrase what they're saying. It is important for the DM to distinguish between placed treasures and those found with random encounters. The scale of the two is vastly different. Monster descriptions in the Monstrous Compendium differentiate between treasure found in a creature's lair, den, or base and those carried by individuals. Treasure gained through a random encounter will be smaller than treasure gained through a planned encounter. If a random treasure is larger or more significant than a placed one, the players are going to remember and value the random encounter over the plot. Treasure should be used to build the adventure, develop a plot, and reward intelligent and daring play. If they just appear randomly, not only is the DM throwing away a useful adventure building advice, He is threatening his overall campaign. In general, a large treasure should be a planned part of an adventure, a way to motivate players, or a goal to be achieved by the characters. And remember, as important as treasure is, it need not be the sole motivator of the story. Indeed, there are times when it will be unimportant to the adventure. In these cases, the plot doesn't need the outside motivation of cash to interest the players. Still, small rewards should be made available to the players. A treasure reward, no matter how small, gives the players the feeling that their characters are succeeding and moving ahead. At this point, I hope you've learned something, or at least have some things to think about next time you assign treasure. And with that, let's move on to part 2. The treasure tables begin with table 84 on page 133. I'm going to explain how to use the table in general, and then explain what the individual columns do and what they mean. If you see an entry that has dashes and nothing else, it means that this item isn't present in this treasure type. For example, if we look at treasure type F, there's a slash in the copper column, meaning there won't be any copper pieces present in this treasure type. If the entry has a percentage under it, it means we roll percentile to see if that item is present. For example, if we look at type A treasure under the copper column, it says 1,000 to 3,000, 25%. We would roll percentile dice, and if we got 1 through 25, there would be 1,000 to 3,000 copper pieces present as part of the treasure. If we rolled a 26 or higher, this item wouldn't be present, so there would be 0 copper pieces. Normally, if this was present, you would roll 1d3 times 1,000 to get a random range between 1 and 3,000, but you could also just choose a number in that range or use another method to generate that number. When I first started DMing, I would roll a bunch of d10s to get digits for the hundreds, tens, and ones, because I thought it was unrealistic for the treasure to be a round number. I stopped doing this fairly quickly since I figured out that it didn't add any fun or immersion, it just made for more math. However, that's just my experience, yours may be different. Let's move on to the next item. If an entry just has a range and no percentage, that treasure is automatically present. For example, if we look in the lower half of table 84 at treasure type O, it says 10 to 40 in the copper column with no percentage. This means that there's always 10 to 40 copper pieces in this treasure type. Determining exactly how many in the 10 to 40 range is usually rolled as d4 times 10, but again, you could just choose or use another method like we would have on the last item. Now that we know how to read the treasure entries on the table, let's look at what the columns represent, starting with the treasure types on the left, or the column with all the letters in it. To do this, we're going to have to jump over to the Monstrous Manual. In the front of the Monstrous Manual, there's a section titled How to Use This Book. In this section, there's a block of text titled Treasure, and this is what it says. Treasure refers to the treasure tables in the Dungeon Master's Guide. If individual treasure is indicated, each individual may carry it, or not, at the DM's discretion. Major treasures are usually found in the monster's lair. These are more often designed and placed by the DM. Intelligent monsters will use the magical items present and try to carry off their most valuable treasures if hard pressed. If treasure is assigned randomly, roll for each treasure possible. If all rolls fail, no treasure of any type is found. Treasure should be adjusted downward if a few monsters are encountered. Large treasures are noted by a multiplier, times 10 for example. This should not be confused with treasure type X. Treasure types listed in parentheses are treasures found in the creature's lair. Do not use tables to place dungeon treasure, since the numbers encountered underground will be much smaller. In this block of text, they reinforce the idea that the DM is in charge of treasure and should adjust it to make sense in their game. There's also the idea that intelligent monsters will act intelligently, using items against the party and fleeing with their loot if necessary. This section also tells us how to read the treasure descriptions in the monstrous manual. For example, let's look at the hobgoblins from earlier. Their treasure is listed as J, M, D, and Q times 5. We now know that treasures J, M, and D are what the individual hobgoblins carry, and that the treasure in parentheses, the Q times 5, is what they keep in their lair. The next 4 columns are for coins. On page 134 of the DMG, it tells us that if the coins are part of an intelligent creature's hoard, they will be stored in chests or bags. They also tell us that coins generally weigh 50 to a pound. If you aren't familiar with the exchange rates between the different coin types, this is shown on table 42 on page 66 of the Player's Handbook. The copper, silver, and gold coins are pretty much self-explanatory, and most players are familiar with them. Platinum and electrum might need some explaining. Platinum coins are worth 5 gold pieces each. In the real world, platinum coins weren't made until the 1800s as far as I can tell. However, this can help reinforce the idea that the game takes place in a world where the previous civilization could produce things that can no longer be made. On the other hand, electrum coins are almost the exact opposite. Electrum is a naturally occurring alloy of gold, silver, and traces of other metals. It was used for currency very early on, but fell out of favor when it was found you could remove the silver and impurities from gold in a process that involves regular table salt. This was in full swing by the time of the Roman Empire, so if electrum currency exists in the real world, it's ancient. Every DM I've ever played with always chooses for the platinum or electrum column to always be platinum pieces, so it doesn't really matter. But I thought I would explain what electrum currency was for those of you who are curious. Before we move on to gems, I'd like to tell you how I handle coins, not just as treasure, but in game in general. I use a concept I call abstraction for convenience, which is the idea that if we are willing to be slightly less realistic with how we handle a thing in game, we can simplify the math involved in a way that more than makes up for it. Remember earlier when I said I give a round number for treasure because having a realistic number doesn't make the game better, it just makes the math worse? That's an example of abstraction for convenience. Another is that I have coins weigh 100 to a pound. This makes it easy to figure out how much they weigh because you just drop the last 2 zeros or move the decimal over 2. For example, 1,000 gold pieces weighs 10 pounds. 3,000 copper pieces weighs 30 pounds. You get the idea. Another is that coins have different denominations, but it doesn't matter since a gold coin worth 5 gold pieces is the same weight as 5 gold coins worth 1 gold piece each. They're all handled as gold pieces, but your character sees it as a pile of coins of different denominations. Again, we make an abstraction for convenience to make the game easier to run. You might be wondering what 100 coins to a pound might look like, and so I went to the US Mint website to look up the weights of common US coins for comparison. If we're honest, the largest coin most people handle on a daily basis is the quarter, and they are 80 to a pound. On the other end of the spectrum, we have the dime, and they're 200 to a pound. Although silver is a bit heavier than cupronickel, we can see that at least with silver and copper that 100 coins to a pound isn't a ridiculous idea. With gold, I had to look up examples of historical gold coins and ran across the Spanish escudo. I picked this one because the 2 escudo coin was the historical basis for the gold doubloon, and I think that's something most people have heard of. A 2 escudo coin weighs 6.2 grams, which means there's about 73 of them to a pound, or 146 escudo to a pound. What I can gather from this is that a 1 gold piece coin that weighs 100 to a pound isn't impossible, especially if some of these coins are actually larger denominations with the same weight to value ratio. The last house rule I use regarding coins is that instead of the platinum piece, I have a mithril piece, which is worth 10 gold pieces. Since it's worth the same as a pound of silver, this unit of currency is also sometimes called a pound. With that, I'm going to stop rambling about coins, and now we can look at how gems work. If gems are part of a treasure, we use table 85 to determine their value. We can do this for each individual gem, or if there are a lot of them, we can do them in groups. In addition to the values given on table 85, there are circumstances where the gems will have a different value than what's given on the table. One scenario where gems have a different value than what's on the table is that the DM has the option to say gems are uncut. Uncut gems have a value equal to 10% of their base value. Another is that there's a 10% chance that gems are unusual, and for those we roll on table 86. The role of gems as a portable form of wealth became less important with the jump from 1st edition to 2nd edition. In 1st edition, gold pieces were 10 to a pound. So for instance, if you had to pay 1,000 gold pieces for something, those coins weighed 100 pounds. In 2nd edition, that same amount of gold weighs 20 pounds. And if you run money the way I do, it's 10 pounds. Either way, the role of gems as a portable wealth is just not nearly as important as it used to be. The next column we're going to look at is art objects. Art objects are covered briefly in the DMG on page 134, and the text reads as follows. This category includes jewelry, ornamental drinking vessels, elaborate snuff boxes, fine crystal and glass, statuary, carvings, and all these other small embellishments that make life more pleasant and easy to bear. The value of each should be determined on table 87. After table 87, it goes on to say, the DM should name each item found by the player characters, since this helps them picture in their minds just what they have found. This is table 87, and as you can see, it just gives the value of the items. What form they take is up to the DM. How I interpret this is that art objects aren't just the things we usually think of, but rather fit in the broad category of non-magical stuff that is valuable. And these things can take several different forms. The first one I'll talk about are the usual things like statues, paintings, gem-encrusted goblets, silver eating utensils, etc. Items like this are great to use as treasures for bandits, thieves, or petty warlords. The next category of non-magical stuff that is valuable would be expensive trade goods. Remember at the beginning of the video the part about treasure being expensive textiles, furs, wine, etc.? This is where I have items like that come into play. Treasure like this is good, especially if there's a nearby trade route that gets raided often. The DM can use the treasure to drop lore about the world. It's one thing to tell the players that a region is known for their fine wine, but another for them to learn this bit of lore by finding casks of wine as part of a bandit gang's treasure and see this firsthand. I also place in this category things that the previous civilization made that can't be made anymore. Either way, these items are a good way to drop lore about your world, but in a way that is relevant to the decisions the players have to make. The last category within this class of items would be what I broadly refer to as equipment. Some of these things might have belonged to and been used by the treasure hoard's previous owner or owners. Perhaps the hobgoblins are getting ready to send their annual tribute to their warlord, and so the players just happen to have access to their cargo wagons, or the boat that they were going to use to do that. Equipment might also be from adventurers who tried to do what the players are doing and failed. This is a way to give the players more equipment in the middle of an adventure, especially if you have something planned that they aren't equipped to handle. An example would be if the characters are going to have to climb a sheer rock face, but don't have any climbing gear. This isn't as hokey as it might initially sound. The previous group might have had better intel than the party has and prepared accordingly, only to fail before they got to the obstacle where they needed that equipment. This also reinforces the idea that the player characters aren't the only group of adventurers doing stuff in the world. It also helps to answer the question, what happens to a party's equipment when there's a TPK? No, really, think about it. Come to think of it, this can also be a source of the next group of items we're going to look at. Magical items are the last column on our table. I think the text at the beginning of the section on magical items is worth reading out loud, so I'm going to do that. When possible, the DM should select the magical items he gives out in his campaign. Sometimes, however, the DM has more pressing game matters on his mind. To determine randomly what magical item has been found, roll on table 88. This table directs you to one of the specific categories in tables 89 through 108. Items followed by a group name are usable only by characters of that group. Note, XP value is the number of experience points a character gets for making an item. I think this part here is important because it reiterates what the book said earlier about how the DM is in charge of treasure. I also interpret it to be implying that you can't blame the tables for messed up treasure, since treasure is up to the DM and that the table is basically a random suggestion generator, again with final approval being on the DM. This next bit down here about groups is referring to how in 2nd edition, the standard character classes are part of 4 groups, those being warriors, rogues, priests, and wizards. If you want to learn more about how character classes and their associated groups work, it starts on page 26 of the PHB. This last sentence here is just to clarify that the listed XP value is for if you make an item, not if you find it. Now let's look at how the tables work. When rolling for magical items, we start out by rolling percentile on table 88. I'm going to roll 3 random items so we can see how this works. First, we roll percentile dice, and we get a 12. That gives us a potion, so now we go down the page to table 89, potions and oils. The d6 in parentheses means that we roll a d6 to see which subtable we need to roll on, so we roll our d6, and we get a 4. That sends us to subtable B, because the 3 and 4 here in parentheses mean we go here on a roll of 3 or 4. It tells us to roll a d20, and we get an 8. So that means our first item is a potion of invisibility. Let's go back to table 88 and roll for our second item. And we get 78. 78 is a weapon, so let's go to table 108 on page 140. It has 2 subtables. One says 1 through 2, and the other says 3 through 6. It doesn't say what die to roll, and that's probably a typo, but we can infer from the number range that they're using that we need to roll a d6. And we got a 1. So that's subtable A. Let's roll a d20 and see what we get next. And we roll a 12. It's a dagger. Now we need to roll on table 109, which is the next table down, in order to see what the bonuses are. And that's a 6, so it's a +1. So item number 2 is a +1 dagger. All right, let's see what our last item is, and once again we go back to table 88. And we roll a 6, another potion. We need to roll to see which subtable, and we roll a 3. This is the same table we rolled on earlier. Let's see what we get this time. And it's a 4. That makes our last item a potion of healing. So that makes our 3 items a potion of invisibility, a +1 dagger, and a potion of healing. I think that pretty much covers how treasure works in 2nd edition AD&D. I'm sure there are things I didn't cover and some things I didn't cover as well as I could have. If you have questions, please leave them in the comments. If I can't answer a question, one of the other viewers on this channel probably can. Thanks for watching. His Holiness the Cat of True Seeing and I would like to wish you a wonderful rest of your day.